This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 24, Champion of Man's Rights. The morning light slanted through the parlor windows as Margaret set down her quill and reached for the blotting paper. The letter before her was nearly finished, just a few more lines to a friend about the changes in Washington now that Congress had convened. With a careful hand, she blotted the ink, then wiped the quill tip clean before setting it neatly beside the inkwell. She leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes drift toward the window. Sydney, their country estate, served as a respite from the hustle and bustle of the city. Not that she really considered Washington, D.C. a proper city. Certainly not like Philadelphia where she'd been raised. No, the new capital was a sprawling construction site by comparison. Margaret had been married only 3 months now, and she was still adjusting to life away from the refined social circles of Philadelphia. But there was an excitement in the air here in the capital. Change, movement, important men shaping the nation's future. Politics had become a topic of great debate as they came to the conclusion of a most contentious presidential election. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr had tied for votes in the Electoral College, and even now the outcome was yet to be determined, waiting for the House to decide the victor. Her husband Samuel had been rigorously reporting the events in his newspaper. He was thrilled at the prospect of Jefferson becoming president, but Margaret had her reservations. She came from a Federalist-leaning family and didn't understand her husband's unreserved support of the man and his firm Republican stance. From what she'd heard about Jefferson, the man was of questionable character at best. Some reports said that he was an atheist, a radical, and even a danger to American morality. All she knew was that much would be determined by the outcome of this election. She was pulled from her thoughts by a sharp rap on the door just before a servant entered, stepping inside to admit a visitor. Margaret rose to her feet, smoothing her skirts. The gentleman who entered was a stranger. He was tall, very tall. He had to be over 6 feet, with auburn, gray-streaked hair and hazel eyes. Despite the simpleness of his apparel and his relaxed posture, he had an air of dignity about him. "I hope I do not intrude," he said. "Not at all, sir," Margaret said, sliding into her role as the gracious hostess. "Mr. Smith has just stepped out, but he will be back soon if you'd like to wait for him." The man nodded, smiling warmly. He had a humble, kindly presence about him that instantly set her perfectly at ease. By the rules of formality, they would need to wait for a common acquaintance to introduce them before learning each other's names. But Margaret was used to her husband having visitors, and they easily struck up a conversation about the commonplace topics of the day. The gentleman asked her questions that directed the conversation back to her own personal interests and observations. He listened with such interest, such unfeigned kindness, that she found herself almost forgetting that he'd come to speak with her husband and not her. When the door finally did open, and her husband Samuel stepped inside, she was sad for the conversation to be cut short. Samuel smiled enthusiastically, coming forward to shake the gentleman's hand. After apologizing for his absence, he gestured to Margaret, saying, "Mr. Jefferson, please allow me to present my wife, Mrs. Smith." Margaret's smile faltered. As the gentleman shook her hand, she fought to mask her embarrassment. Her cheeks burned and her heart throbbed. She didn't speak again while he remained. She scarcely listened to the conversation at all. She was too overcome by the revolution of feeling taking place inside her. This was Thomas Jefferson? The Thomas Jefferson. The man reputed by Federalist newspapers to be vulgar and coarse in both appearance and manners? As she watched him and her husband converse, she again observed Jefferson's gentlemanly and dignified manners, his refined language, gentle voice, and kind countenance. How immediately her preconceived notions dismantled, her opinions undergoing immense transformation, as rumor gave way to experience. She knew that she had been the victim of prejudice. She had been unjust in her opinion of him. She knew now that Thomas Jefferson was not the villain that the newspapers painted him to be. On the contrary, he was, by all that she could tell by both appearance and manners, a truly good man. As he departed, he cordially shook hands with both Margaret and her husband, in a way that said as plainly as any words could, "I am your friend." Water is essential to all life. Approximately 71% of our planet is covered in water, but only about 1% of it is readily available and drinkable. Now, those are some pretty astounding numbers, considering how critical water is to our survival. When I go to the mountains, I love to see the brooks carrying the runoff from snow-covered peaks into the valleys. But anyone who's spent time in nature knows that you can't drink directly from a stream, because the water often becomes contaminated by natural and human activities upstream. Without filtering it, you could get waterborne illnesses. But your chances of finding clean water are much higher if you hike upstream and find a water source, a spring head, where the water has not been exposed to so many contaminants. If my study of history has taught me anything, it's the importance of not drinking downstream. We are surrounded by seas of information, but only a small portion of it is the pure truth. Very little of what we watch and read now brings strength and life rather than poisoning the one who consumes it. Too many biographies, when traced to their roots, originate not in facts, but deeply contaminated opinions. Beware of historians who try to paint you a picture of who they think someone was instead of who they really were. As the English novelist Samuel Butler once wrote, "Though God cannot alter the past, historians can." Today we see a massive reinterpretation of historical personalities, and I doubt whether these people we study would even recognize themselves based on the description of modern historians. One of the greatest victims of this is the champion of human rights, Thomas Jefferson, a man who, even among the brilliant and honorable men of his time that we call the Founding Fathers, was truly a giant. American historian James Truslow Adams called him the most intensely American of all the great figures of his time. Another historian, Henry Steele Commager, took it a step further, saying, "Jefferson is the central figure in American history, and if freedom and democracy survive in our generation, he may yet prove to be the central figure in modern history." Thomas Jefferson stands out as one of the foremost champions of the rights of man. So it shouldn't surprise us that there have been great efforts to mar his memory. New biographies have surfaced over recent decades, presenting their own new takes on Jefferson's life and character. But as biographer Andrew M. Allison stated it, the standard approach among today's writers is to analyze and interpret him for the reader. We are not permitted to look at Jefferson directly, but rather through the eyes of various authors who summarize what he did and paraphrase what he said, then carefully explain why he did and said those things. Every few years, another author comes along with still one more fresh interpretation. As these pile up, one on top of another, the thoughtful reader begins to wonder who in the world Thomas Jefferson really was. In other words, the waters get awfully murky. One of the main problems is that people have preconceived ideas about Jefferson. And that's not something that's completely unique to our time. There were a lot of people even in Jefferson's own day who did not understand him, as the following story relayed by Allison illustrates. One day, as President Jefferson was riding along one of the highways leading into Washington, he overtook a stranger who was making his way toward the city on foot. He drew up his horse and greeted the man, as was his custom. The traveler returned his greeting, and they immediately launched into a political discussion. People talked as freely about politics then as we do about the weather now. Not realizing whom he was addressing, the man indulged in some unkind remarks about the president, referring to several indecent and slanderous accusations which his political opponents had recently printed in the newspapers. Jefferson's first impulse was to bid the fellow a good day and ride on, but he was held by his amusement at the situation. After listening a few more minutes, he asked the stranger whether he knew the president personally. "No," said the man, "nor do I wish to." "But do you think it fair," Jefferson asked, "to repeat such stories about a man whom you dare not face?" "I will never shrink from meeting Mr. Jefferson, should he ever come my way." "Will you go to his house tomorrow at 10 o'clock and be introduced to him if I promise to meet you there at that hour?" "Yes, I will," he decided, after a moment's thought. Jefferson then excused himself, touched his hat to the traveler, and rode away toward Washington. When the man appeared in the executive mansion the next morning, a servant answered the door and escorted him down a hall to President Jefferson's office. As he came face to face with the president, he suddenly realized what had happened. Greatly embarrassed, but with gentlemanly bearing, he managed to say, "I have called, Mr. Jefferson, to apologize for having said to a stranger—" "Hard things of an imaginary being who is no relation of mine," interrupted Jefferson, as he gave the man his hand and a warm, good-natured smile. The red-faced visitor turned out to be a merchant of high standing from Kentucky, and Jefferson insisted that he stay for dinner so they could become better acquainted. He did stay, and was quickly won over to the president, who he had unknowingly insulted the day before. From that day forward, the merchant and his family were fiery Jeffersonians. Like so many other Americans, they quickly acquired a sincere affection for this tall, soft-spoken statesman from Virginia, and a deep commitment to the principles of freedom that he advocated. This story resembles Margaret Bayard Smith's experience, whose opinion of Jefferson was revolutionized by a single meeting with him. My hope for this episode is that you can have that same kind of experience, that we might together make the hike upstream, sorting through the array of misunderstandings and find the pure water, the truth about one of our most prominent founding fathers. Now, to cover a subject as vast as the life of Thomas Jefferson, it's impossible for me to do it in one episode. So similar to how I did the episodes on Lafayette, I'll be splitting it into two parts. In this episode, we'll discuss the first part of Thomas Jefferson's life and his role in the Revolution. In the next, we'll talk about his family and his presidency. Throughout, I will endeavor to address the accusations laid against him, and give you an accurate view of his character, convictions, and faith. Thomas Jefferson was born April 13, 1743 at Shadwell, his father's estate in Virginia. He was the third child and first son born to his parents. His mother came from one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Virginia, whereas his father was a self-made man, who, though he had not had a lot of access to education, was, quote, "of a strong mind, sound judgment, and eager after information. He read much and improved himself." His father held a number of leadership positions in local offices, including a lieutenant colonel in the local militia, a justice of the peace, and as a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. Thomas Jefferson began his schooling at 5 years old. He tells the story of how in his first year he snuck out of the classroom, but then knelt beside the building to repeat the Lord's Prayer, hoping to hasten the hour of forgiveness. But as he grew, so did his enthusiasm for learning. He was said to be a very inquisitive youth, prone to ask questions until his curiosity was satiated. One woman remarked that she, quote, "never knew anyone to ask so many questions as Thomas Jefferson." At 9 years old, he began studying under a private tutor, and within 5 years, he could read Latin, Greek, and French. Not long after, he would add Spanish, Italian, and Anglo-Saxon. He returned home at 14, but his happy arrival was soon overshadowed by tragedy. Just a few short weeks later, his father unexpectedly died. This was devastating to the young Jefferson, who deeply loved and admired his father. He quickly inherited his father's estate at Shadwell and became the man of the family. These were turbulent years for Thomas Jefferson. Looking back at that time, he said, "When I recollect that at 14 years of age, the whole care and direction of myself was thrown on myself entirely, without a relation or friend qualified to advise or guide me, and recollect the various sorts of bad company with which I associated from time to time, I am astonished I did not turn off with some degree of them and become as worthless to society as they were." But thanks to a provision in his father's will that ensured that Jefferson received a good education under the influence of trusted individuals, the young man was not left without guiding influences. Many of these noble individuals that would help shape his character he met as a student at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He wrote, "I had the good fortune to become acquainted very early with some characters of very high standing, and to feel the incessant wish that I could ever become what they were. Under temptations and difficulties, I would ask myself, what would Dr. Small, Mr. Wythe, or Peyton Randolph do in this situation? What course in it will ensure me their approbation? I am certain that this mode of deciding on my conduct tended more to correctness than any reasoning powers I possessed." One of the most influential of these mentors in Jefferson's life was George Wythe. Wythe was a lawyer, and a big reason that Thomas Jefferson would decide to study law himself. Describing this man whom Jefferson sometimes referred to as his second father, he said, "No man ever left behind him a character more venerated than George Wythe. His virtue was of the purest tint, his integrity inflexible, and his justice exact. Of warm patriotism, and devoted as he was to liberty and the natural and equal rights of man, he might truly have been called the Cato of his country." After he became president, Jefferson still referred to George Wythe as, quote, "my ancient master, my earliest and best friend, and to him I am indebted for first impressions, which have had the most salutary influence on the course of my life." Even as an old man, Jefferson could still say, "Mr. Wythe continues to be my faithful and beloved mentor in youth, and my most affectionate friend through life." The two men would later serve together in Congress and be fellow signers of the Declaration of Independence. It was also while at college in Williamsburg that Thomas Jefferson first met the fiery orator Patrick Henry, a man whose impassioned words would leave an indelible impression on the young Jefferson. Thomas made his way down the Duke of Gloucester Street, tugging at the cuffs of his jacket as he navigated his way down the bustling road. At 22, he was a good deal taller than most of the men he passed, standing out even in a crowd. The weather was rapidly changing in Williamsburg, the wintry chill finally giving way to the humid warmth of Virginia spring. The capital was especially busy since the House of Burgesses was in session. Activity was everywhere. Carriages and horses transporting government officials, merchants discussing their business, and taverns filled with lively political discussions. Williamsburg was, after all, the center of government, commerce, and education. But recent developments had made politics a source of greater debate than ever before. Thomas steered his course toward the Capitol building. It was a walk that he made frequently, as part of his education was to witness government proceedings in action. It gave him the chance to see how laws were shaped and debated. He had immersed himself in his studies in Williamsburg, often spending up to 15 hours a day soaking in the words and philosophies of the great minds of the past. But of course, he'd still found time to attend weekend dances, concerts, stage plays, and horse races. In his first year of college, he had to admit that he'd spent too much money on clothes and horses, not to mention books. He loved going into the local bookshops and finding titles on every subject that piqued his interest. As Thomas made his way into the lobby of the Capitol, he found other spectators, clerks, and law students like himself gathered outside the House of Burgesses chamber. The door was open, and Thomas moved closer, hoping to catch a glimpse of their deliberations. The room was crowded with elected representatives and government officials, among other influential figures in the colony. Thomas spotted his mentor George Wythe, and his was not the only face that Thomas recognized. He also saw Patrick Henry, a new member of the Assembly. The spirited orator had graduated in law a couple of years before Thomas had begun his studies. Their paths had crossed a number of times. Henry had briefly studied under George Wythe himself. Now the young lawyer sat listening, his dark, penetrating eyes observing the proceedings with simmering passion. As the meeting went on, several of the older members left early to return to their plantations, clearly thinking that nothing of significance was left to be discussed. Then, to Thomas's surprise, the meeting took a dramatic turn. Toward the end of the session, Patrick Henry boldly rose to his feet. All eyes turned on him. To the astonishment of everyone present, Henry began introducing what he termed his Virginia Resolves. They were his response to the recent Stamp Acts, which had met with a great deal of resistance all across the colonies. It was, after all, the first direct tax that the Crown had imposed, impacting all levels of society. Henry began openly criticizing the Crown's overreach, declaring that only Virginia's own legislature had the right to tax its citizens. Anything beyond that were unjust laws, and Virginians were thus not obligated to obey them. The tension in the room grew palpable, and Thomas pressed himself closer to the door, straining to catch Patrick's words, as murmurs of discord fell over the room. Henry pressed on, his impassioned words echoing through the vaulted chamber. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. Here he paused as cries of treason erupted throughout the room. Over the shouts, Henry finished his sentence saying, "May profit from their example. If this be treason, then make the most of it." Thomas stood riveted in place. Such a torrent of language he had never heard before. Patrick Henry seemed to speak as the Greek poet Homer wrote, his words powerful and vivid. His fiery speech seemed to have kindled something within Thomas. As he stood in that crowded doorway, a flame of liberty and patriotism was lit, and Thomas knew that he would never be the same. Thomas Jefferson later referred to this day, when he overheard Patrick Henry's speech in the Capitol building, as the most important day of his life. He was only 22 at the time, and stood at a figurative crossroad. Looking back almost half a century later, Jefferson wrote of this period of his life, quote, "From the circumstances of my position, I was often thrown into the society of horse racers, card players, fox hunters, scientific and professional men, and of dignified men. And many a time I have asked myself in the enthusiastic moment of the death of a fox, the victory of a favorite horse, the issue of a question eloquently argued at the bar or in the great council of the nation, well, which of these kinds of reputations should I prefer? That of a horse jockey, a fox hunter, an orator, or the honest advocate of my country's rights?" Jefferson would choose to be the latter. In his pursuit of legal training, Jefferson was not hasty or flippant about the endeavor. Where many young men spent about a year in their law studies, Jefferson spent over half a decade. It may be safe to say that no other American had ever been so prepared to enter the profession. And it showed in his time as a lawyer over the next 7 years. He was as thorough as they come. And as one elderly man, who had often heard Jefferson deliver legal arguments in Williamsburg, later recalled to his grandsons, Jefferson, quote, "always took the right side." It wasn't long before Jefferson was sought out by men of high standing. He was away on business when he received word that Shadwell, his family's estate, had burned to the ground, destroying almost every book he owned. Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, was passionate about agriculture and had made a lot of improvements on his father's estate, so this would have been devastating news. However, Jefferson had also become very passionate about architecture and loved to study the beautiful structures in the Old World. So he began a major construction project, the erection of his estate that would be known as Monticello. Jefferson envisioned a beautiful home on top of a mountainside. His house, in a way, was a metaphor for his life. Chinard Gilbert observed, as he had planned to build a house according to his own plans, he had likewise decided to construct for himself, with material just as carefully chosen, the intellectual house in which he intended to live. Had not the Revolution intervened, Thomas Jefferson would probably have spent his years in his native colony, becoming a successful member of the Virginia bar, perhaps a judge, learned and respected, a wealthy landowner adding constantly to the paternal acres. He had no ambition and little suspected his own latent genius. And yet during all these years, which he might have passed in leisurely and pleasant idleness, he never ceased, unknowingly as it were, to prepare himself for the great part he was to play. When the call came, he was ready. A careful study of Thomas Jefferson's life confirms what Gilbert observed. He was indeed prepared very carefully for the role he was to play. Jefferson's career in politics began when he was just 25, several years before he was married. I'll tell you all about his marriage and family in the next episode. He became a member of the House of Burgesses, the legislative assembly in Virginia. One of the first efforts he made with his political influence gives us a lot of insight into Thomas Jefferson's mind. He wrote, "In 1769, I became a member of the legislature by the choice of the county in which I live, and so continued until it was closed by the Revolution. I made one effort in that body for the permission of the emancipation of slaves, which was rejected. And indeed, during the regal government, nothing liberal could expect success. So, in other words, one of the first things he did with political power was try to emancipate the slaves. Now, Thomas Jefferson had a large plantation, and he owned slaves himself, many of which came from his marriage to his wife Martha. So how do we reconcile this? Well, as is often the case, we're missing context. You need to understand the world in which they lived and the laws under which they operated at this time. Up until 1782, it was illegal to free enslaved people in Virginia without special permission from the governor and legislature, and few were granted this permission. Hence why Jefferson was trying to change the law. But these legal complexities apply even more so to slaves that were acquired through marriage. Because if a woman was a widow, as Martha Jefferson was when she married Thomas Jefferson, she didn't actually own the slaves. They were part of her share of her late husband's estate, which she could use during her lifetime, but she couldn't sell or give them away. The enslaved people were meant to go to the husband's heirs after the widow died, which meant that even if she and her new husband wanted to set them free, they legally couldn't. So they were stuck in a kind of legal limbo where emancipation just wasn't an option. Now, there was a legal caveat that allowed people to free their slaves in their will, which is what George Washington did, but even that was really complicated. So it became out of practical necessity, both because of the laws and the Virginia plantation system, that Jefferson kept his slaves. But of all the founding fathers, Jefferson was one of the most outspoken against slavery. He said, "My sentiments on the subject of slavery have long since been in the possession of the public, and time has only served to give them stronger root. The love of justice and the love of country plead equally the cause of these people, and it is a moral reproach to us that they should have pleaded it so long in vain. Yet the hour of emancipation is advancing in the march of time. It will come." When he returned home from working as an American diplomat in France, his daughter Martha gives us a description of his return and his servant's response upon seeing him. She wrote that they, quote, discovered the approach of the carriage as soon as it reached Shadwell, and such a scene I never witnessed in my life. They collected in crowds around it, and almost drew it up the mountain by hand. When the door of the carriage was opened, they received him in their arms and bore him to the house, crowding around and kissing his hands and feet, some blubbering and crying, others laughing. It seemed impossible to satisfy their anxiety to touch and kiss the very earth which bore him. As a young slave named Isaac, who worked at Monticello, said, "Old master was very kind to servants." But Captain Edmund Bacon, Jefferson's overseer, goes into greater detail about Jefferson's treatment of his slaves. He said, "Mr. Jefferson was always very kind and indulgent to his servants. He would not allow them to be at all overworked, and he would hardly ever allow one of them to be whipped. His orders to me were constant, that if there was any servant that could not get along without the chastising that was customary, to dispose of him. He could not bear to have a servant whipped, no odds how much he deserved it." One incident that Bacon recounts especially illustrates this. It was an incident involving a young slave named Jim Hubbard, who worked in the nail factory. When Bacon was filling an order, he noticed that all of the 8-penny nails were missing. Later, he discovered that Jim had stolen them and hidden them in a tree. He said, quote, "Mr. Jefferson was at home at the time, and when I went up to Monticello, I told him of it. He was very much surprised and felt very badly about it. Jim had always been a favorite servant. He told me to be at my house next morning when he took his ride, and he would see Jim there. When he came, I sent for Jim, and I never saw any person, white or black, feel as badly as he did when he saw his master. He was mortified and distressed beyond measure. He had been brought up in my shop, and we had all confidence in him. Now his character was gone. The tears streamed down his face, and he begged pardon over and over again. I felt very badly myself. Mr. Jefferson turned to me and said, 'Ah, sir, we can't punish him. He has suffered enough already.' He then talked to him, gave him a heap of good advice, and sent him to the shop. Grady, who was the supervisor of the nailery, had waited, expecting to be sent for to whip him, and he was astonished to see him come back and go to work after such a crime. When he, Grady, came to dinner, he boarded with me then. He told me that when Jim came back to the shop, he said, 'Well, I's been a seekin' religion a long time, but I never heard anything before that sounded so, or made me feel so, as I did when Master said, "Go, and don't do so any more. And now I's determined to seek religion till I find it.' And sure enough, he afterwards came to me for a permit to go and be baptized. I gave him one, and never knew of his doing anything of the sort again. He was always a good servant afterwards." Later during the Civil War, when Bacon was an old man, he said, "No servants ever had a kinder master than Mr. Jefferson's. He did not like slavery. I have heard him talk a great deal about it. He thought it a bad system. I have heard him prophesy that we should have just such trouble with it as we are having now." After the war, Jefferson was actually appointed as a chairman of a congressional committee over westward expansion. As part of his plan for creating new territories, he proposed a clause prohibiting slavery in any new territories after 1800. Had this proposal been accepted, it might very well have prevented the Civil War. But the proposal was defeated by one vote. Jefferson said, "The voice of a single individual would have prevented this abominable crime from spreading itself over the new country. Thus we see the fate of millions unborn hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. But it is to be hoped that it will not always be silent, and that the friends to the rights of human nature will in the end prevail." But Jefferson worried what might have to take place before this victory for the rights of human nature could prevail. He said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation, is among possible events, and that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. Boy, did Jefferson get that right. But despite many attempts made during his life to end slavery, Jefferson would not be successful, and the country would have to be brought to its knees to rid itself of that gross transgression. But still, seeking the freedom of man would be at the core of Thomas Jefferson's motivations throughout his entire life. During his early days in politics, he became increasingly interested in governmental theory and began a serious study of the philosophy of politics. It's doubtful whether any founding father studied the topic more thoroughly than him. He drank deeply from the well of history's greatest minds, including Blackstone, Locke, and Montesquieu. He was especially fascinated by the Israelites' people's law and the Anglo-Saxons' common law, both forms of free government. In fact, when they were proposing the seal for America, Jefferson, who was part of that committee, proposed that on one side they have the Israelites being led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, which was similar to Benjamin Franklin's suggestion with the parting of the Red Sea, and on the other side, depicting profiles of the two Anglo-Saxon brothers, Hengist and Horsa, the first to introduce common law among the British's Anglo-Saxon ancestors before they became a monarchy. But that's a subject we could cover in an entirely different episode. The important thing to understand is that Jefferson looked to these groups, among other histories and philosophies, for inspiration. He didn't believe that they were creating something entirely new, but in essence returning to true principles that had worked in the past. As Gilbert wrote, quote, "To go back to a primitive past, to the good old times, had been the dream of many political philosophers, but Jefferson's vision of that ancestral past was no dream, for it had originated in the only part of the inhabited earth where it could become a reality. This was the true background of the Declaration of Independence." Jefferson soaked in these great truths, unknowingly preparing for what was to come. He gained the reputation of a masterly pen, and it was this skill that would forever immortalize him, as he crafted a document that would give birth to a new nation and forever alter the course of history. The heavy wooden doors of the Pennsylvania State House creaked as Thomas stepped out into the warm Philadelphia evening. He adjusted the stack of papers under his arm, his long fingers smudged with ink from the day's discussions. The debates in Congress had been long, voices rising and falling in heated arguments. But now, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, his work was only beginning. With a purposeful stride, Thomas made his way down the bustling streets, the hem of his coat brushing against the uneven cobblestones. Even his light coat felt stifling under the summer heat of Philadelphia. Merchants called out their final offers of the day, and clusters of men stood in doorways, discussing the latest news of the war. Thomas made his way through them, his thoughts distant from the activity around him. As he neared 7th and Market Streets, the small brick home he'd rented from Jacob Graff Jr. came into view. It was modest, but quiet, and provided him the privacy that he needed. He scaled the steps, nodding absently to a passerby before pushing open the door. The day's notes were set down carefully on the wooden table by the window. After placing another sheet of full-scrap paper on his writing desk, he loosened his cravat and settled into a large armchair in the parlor. He'd spent days writing and rewriting, trying to get the wording just right. As he dipped his quill in the ink, the silence of the room pressed upon him, and his thoughts wandered to his family back in Virginia. How was Martha doing? He wondered. His wife's health had been quite frail since their daughter Jane's unexpected death. Jane had been only a year and a half old, and the tragedy had struck so suddenly that it had shaken both he and Martha deeply. Little had Thomas known that his mother would follow his daughter in death about 7 months after that. Thomas lifted a hand to massage his brow, thinking of the intense migraine headaches that had plagued him for weeks after his mother's death. She'd been 57 and in relatively good health when she'd suffered a stroke, and within an hour, she was gone. He'd come back to Philadelphia with a heavy heart. During his meetings in Congress, he often found his thoughts drifting back to home, the beautiful sweeping views of Monticello, and his dear wife and children from whom he had to be separated. Thomas glanced down at the paper in front of him, trying to refocus his thoughts on the Declaration. He remembered quite vividly when the task for drafting the Declaration of Independence had been given to him. 5 members of Congress had been assigned to oversee its creation, but the actual writing had come down to he and John Adams. Thomas had tried to tell John that he ought to write it, but John had immediately dismissed the idea, saying, "I will not, you should do it." "Oh no," Thomas had replied. "Why will you not? You ought to do it." "I will not," John once again insisted. "Why?" "Reasons enough," John answered simply. "What can be your reasons?" Then, in his lawyer-like fashion, John had replied, "Reason first. You are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second. I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third. You can write 10 times better than I can." "Well," said Jefferson, a little taken aback by that, "if you're decided, I will do as well as I can." But as he'd sat down to write, Thomas had realized just how immense the task was. The idea of separating completely from Great Britain was a matter of intense controversy. Even Thomas, who had been a foremost leader in this revolution, had hoped that they might eventually reconcile with Britain. In fact, he was sure that there wasn't a man alive who wanted reconciliation more than himself, or to see an end to the fighting. But this was a matter of principle, a matter of violated God-given rights, and on that front he could not and would sooner cease to exist than yield. With that resolute thought, Thomas applied the quill to the paper and began to write yet another draft of the Declaration. His mind reflected on the colony's grievances and the best way to convey them. The candle beside him burned low as he continued to write. For a little over 2 weeks, he'd typically come straight from his meetings with Congress to his little apartment to spend from around 6 o'clock until midnight working on his composition. He didn't reference any books or notes as he wrote. The words came from a place deep inside him. Outside, Philadelphia hummed with the busyness of life, but inside, Thomas sat alone, continuing his work until well into the night. It was dangerous. It was radical. But as he scanned over the words that he himself had penned, he knew that above all, it was right. Andrew M. Allison wrote, "Many citizens of the United States have considered it providential that Thomas Jefferson was appointed to write the Declaration of Independence. It is safe to say that no other man in the country was so well equipped to do so, both in political philosophy and in literary talent. And the remarkable thing is that Jefferson was only 33 years old at the time, one of the younger members of the Continental Congress. Most Americans at that time didn't even know that he was the author. It wasn't until months or even years later that people learned that it was Jefferson's masterly pen that had written these timeless words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, It is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. As I said before, these ideas weren't new. Many other writers and philosophers had alluded to these ideas before. As Jefferson put it, "Whether I had gathered my ideas from reading or reflection, I do not know. I know only that I turned to neither book nor pamphlet while writing it. I did not consider it as any part of my charge to invent new ideas." As Andrew M. Allison points out, while Jefferson was only one among many writers of his time who believed in the principles contained in the Declaration of Independence, surely no one before him or since has expressed those ideas with such inspired force and eloquence. For the rest of his life, Jefferson remained deeply grateful for the honor of having written the Declaration of Independence, which he once called the holy bond of our Union. Nearly half a century after 1776, he expressed to his old friend James Madison the hope that Americans would always remember the Declaration and cherish its ideals. Quote, "It is a heavenly comfort to see that these principles are yet so strongly felt. I pray God that these principles may be eternal." I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, but in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson included a scathing, rather lengthy paragraph denouncing slavery, and King George III for implementing it in America. Here's just a little glimpse of it. Quote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him." But sadly, because two of the colonies, Georgia and South Carolina, opposed it, the paragraph was taken out. The Declaration underwent intense scrutiny by Congress, but in the end, relatively few changes were made to Jefferson's composition, and the document was approved by Congress and signed in the late afternoon of July 4th, 1776. It was that day in the humid Pennsylvania State House, now called Independence Hall, that the United States of America was born. On the morning of July 8th, printed copies were sent out among the people. In the State House yard, a herald read the Declaration out loud. When those penetrating words were first heard by the American public, John Adams said that, quote, "3 cheers rended the welkin sky. The battalions paraded on the common and gave us the feu de joie, a French gunfire tradition, notwithstanding the scarcity of powder. The bells rang all day and almost all night. Even the chimers chimed away." It was no simple thing for those 56 men to one by one sign their signatures on that document. As Harlow Giles Unger put it, in doing so they, quote, "committed treason and would hang without trial until dead if captured by British authorities." One of the signers, Benjamin Rush, recalled, quote, "the awful silence which pervaded the house when we were called up one after another to the table to subscribe to what was believed by many to be our death warrants." Signer Benjamin Harris, a large heavy-set man, tried to lighten the mood by quipping to the thin Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, "When the hanging scene comes, I shall have all the advantage over you. It will be over with me in a minute, but you will be kicking in the air half an hour after I'm gone." Every single man who signed that document knew the risk they were taking. They willingly pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. In other words, they pledged everything to the American cause. As Benjamin Rush later described in a letter to a French associate, "I can therefore from authority assure you that a fixed determination still prevails in that body to establish the liberties of America or perish in the ruins. No difficulties discourage us, no losses depress us. We look only to heaven and France for our succor." These promises would be put to the test for each of these men as the war raged on, Jefferson being no exception. The house was quiet in the early morning darkness. Thomas sat in his study, a single candle burning as he read over the notes from the previous day. He had always risen before dawn, finding the stillness of morning the best time for thought. Beyond the windows, Monticello's grounds lay in deep shadow, the rolling hills stretching out toward the horizon, waiting for the first light of day. Thomas dipped his pen into an inkwell, preparing to write, when a sudden pounding on the door shattered the silence. He looked up, startled. A moment later, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and then a voice called urgently from the entrance. Thomas stood, moving swiftly to the door as one of his servants unlatched it. Jack Jewett staggered inside, breathless, his face streaked with blood and sweat. His clothes were torn, his great frame heaving from exhaustion. In the dim candlelight, Thomas could see the fresh welts on Jewett's face, where branches had lashed him as he tore through the dense Virginia woods. Thomas stepped forward. "Captain Jewett, what has happened?" "Governor," Jewett gasped, wiping his brow. "Tarleton is coming. 250 men, less than 20 miles away. He means to capture you." Thomas's breath stilled for half a moment. Then he turned sharply, calling for his household. The house sprang to life as servants rushed to wake up his wife and children. He issued hurried instructions. His family was to be taken at once to a friend's estate. Thomas turned back to Jewett, who was sagging against the doorframe. "You have risked much tonight, Captain," he said. "Virginia will not forget it, and neither will I." Jewett gave a brief nod, but immediately moved to the door. He stepped outside, once again mounting his horse. He had more work to do. The legislatures in Charlottesville needed to be warned. With a hard pull on the reins, he spurred the animal forward, disappearing into the night. Thomas remained. He could not take everything, but there were certain things he would not leave to the mercy of Tarleton's men. His papers, his most valuable correspondence. He gathered what he could. But then, just as the first pale light of morning began to creep over the hills, another rider approached at full gallop. The man barely slowed as he shouted, "They're here! Tarleton's men are ascending the mountain!" Thomas wasted no time. He threw a satchel over his shoulder, strode outside, and mounted his horse. With a hard kick to its flanks, he rode for the woods, vanishing into the dense undergrowth just as the first redcoats appeared in the distance. Thomas Jefferson was governor of Virginia when the British attacked Monticello in 1781. The British officer Bannister Tarleton, known for his ruthless tactics that earned him nicknames like Bloody Ban and the Butcher, led a cavalry raid toward Monticello. It was only because of a man named Jack Jewett, known as the Paul Revere of the South, that Jefferson and his family were able to escape, as well as the members of the Virginia General Assembly. Jewett was staying at a tavern in Louisa County, Virginia, when he happened to see the British cavalry on their way to Charlottesville. He rode 40 miles through the night to alert Jefferson and the members of the Assembly of the impending attack. Riding through the rough terrain at night, the low-hanging branches and dense underbrush left Jewett with scars that he would bear the rest of his life. But his bravery prevented Jefferson's capture. Allison describes this scene back at Monticello. Jefferson's servants were lowering his silver and other valuables into a hiding place beneath the porch. They quickly dropped the plank, leaving below one man named Great George, who was unable to get out in time. The faithful servant remained there for the next 18 hours, in darkness and without food, to avoid betraying the location of his master's belongings. Tarleton fortunately chose not to damage the house. But around the same time, General Cornwallis raided Jefferson's Elk Hill plantation, occupying it for 10 days. Unlike Monticello, Elk Hill suffered extensive damage. Livestock were slaughtered, crops burned, and property destroyed. Jefferson recounted, "He destroyed all of my growing crops of corn and tobacco. He burned all of my barns containing the same articles of the last year. Having first taken what he wanted, he used, as was to be expected, all of my stocks of cattle, sheep, and hogs for the sustenance of his army, and carried off all the horses capable of service. Of those too young for service, he cut the throats and he burned all of the fences on the plantation so as to leave it in absolute waste. He carried off also about 30 slaves. Had this been to give them freedom, he would have done right, but it was to consign them to inevitable death from the smallpox and putrid fever then raging in his camp. This I knew afterwards to have been the fate of 27 of them. Devastating as this must have been, it was Cornwallis's last offensive move in the war. Soon the events at Yorktown would play out, leading to the British surrender and America's independence. But this was barely the beginning of the sacrifices that Jefferson would be called upon to make for his country. And we'll discuss many more in the next episode. I bring this up because in recent decades, there has been a dramatic shift in our view of the Founding Fathers. And a lot of that has to do with the way history is taught now. Historian Howard Zinn, for example, whose book, A People's History of the United States, has become required reading in many of our high schools and colleges now. According to Zinn, quote, "The Founding Fathers did lead the war for independence from Britain, but they did not do it for the equal right of all to life, liberty, and equality. Their intention was to set up a new government that would protect the property of slave owners, land speculators, merchants, and bondholders." Really? That was their intention? Honestly, it's scary to think that this is often the history that's being taught in schools today. This narrative so completely contradicts everything that is contained in the Declaration of Independence. As authors Chris and Ted Stewart point out, these men, who Zinn so contemptuously asserts were consumed by selfishness and greed, are the same ones who risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor by throwing down a gauntlet before the most powerful nation on earth in the form of the Declaration of Independence. And it's that document that states that all men are created equal. And Jefferson being the one to pen those words is no irony or contradiction of character. It's who he was, and what he believed with his whole heart. He hoped for and foresaw the time that all mankind would be able to enjoy the rights due them not by the government, but by God, and that there could be a form of government that would act as a protection, not an oppressor, of man's rights. Do we realize what we have? For most of the world's history, mankind has lived under some form of oppression. We start to think that America is the rule. It is not. It is 100% the exception. About 100 to 110 billion people are estimated to have lived on the earth. Of those, only about 4.5% have lived under conditions that we would consider free. Currently, America has the longest standing constitution in the world. Most constitutions have not lasted more than a single person's lifetime. We need to remember that freedom is a fragile thing. We would be wise to heed the words of Thomas Jefferson, who said, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God?" I hope we have not become so conceited as a people that we can look back with scorn at the timeless political truths that these men taught and fought for. The principles contained in the Declaration of Independence will never be outdated, because they were inspired by the God of heaven. This upcoming year, 2026, marks the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. As that time approaches, I invite you to go back to the source and reread that inspired document. Read Jefferson's words and ask yourself if these are not principles worth fighting for. If you do that, you will come to understand, as Isaac Newton put it, that we stand on the shoulders of giants. One of the greatest of which was Thomas Jefferson, who truly was a champion of human rights. In the next episode, we'll explore how he was also a man of great faith and character. His words resonate with the Spirit of God, because as Paul put it, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. It's this spirit that dwells in the hearts of every freedom-loving man and woman, preparing us for a higher purpose and igniting our faith.